Hey everybody, this is Alicia Purdy from the Alive Radio Network with a live interview in the studio with Bethany HOYT, my good friend. I'm really excited to have her as my very first interview on Living Out Loud. So on the show, episode 4 of the show, the July 15th show, we had Bethany on for a live interview about her vision for a 501c3 organization called Saving Grace Adoptions. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about Saving Grace Adoptions, hear a little bit about Bethany's vision, hear about her family. They have a really unique story that you're going to want to hear. It's going to really bless you. So stay tuned for our interview, and we will cover a couple of things that I think you're really going to want to hear. And if you have questions for Bethany, you're welcome to reach out to me through the Alive Radio Network Facebook page, and you're welcome to also contact Bethany. I know that you're on Facebook, and so if they can private message you or something if they would like more information about the things we talk about today. Okay, so this is Bethany HOYT. She's a local to the Capital Region. Bethany, would you give us just a little bit of information about the event you have coming up in July, which is a fundraiser for Saving Grace Adoptions?
Sure. Absolutely, thank you. So we are going to be doing an event called Haley's Vision on Wednesday, July 24th, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. It'll be at Glen Peter Jewelers, Diamond Center right on Central Avenue. I think it's 1544. And really, it's going to be used to help us jumpstart Saving Grace Adoptions, which is will be a non-for-profit organization that exists to be a resource to families and helping to support them during the process of adoption, particularly for those who are interested in the possibility of adopting a child with special needs. Something that's very near and dear to our heart, just given our own story.
Can you tell us a little bit? I want to hear about your family, but can you tell us first, how did you start to conceptualize Saving Grace Adoptions? Where did this come from in your heart?
Yeah. Well, of course, because of our own personal story, adoption has always kind of has a special place in our heart. And actually, even before that, back before I ever even got married, I really felt this kind of strong sense in my spirit, even as a young woman, that I remember telling my husband when we first started dating, I really believe that we're going to adopt someday. I've just always had it in my heart to adopt. I just had no idea how it was going to happen, and it certainly didn't expect it to be the story that we have. But I think what really triggered it more recently for me and started to become something a little bit more specific and concrete as far as a vision of how I could really help to facilitate this for other families was really just what God was doing in my own heart in response to the more expanded abortion laws in New York. So, at the beginning of the year when those things came out, I think we were talking earlier, I initially just felt very angry at the injustice of it, just being very, pro-life and as a Christian and having faith and just believing, that God's the one who gives life and just being very upset by it. But then really in seeking God, just the reality of how being angry isn't really helping anybody, especially being angry at a worldly system that isn't necessarily doing things in a biblical manner. So just praying about how I could have a more positive response to it and really be a support to those who might be in a situation where they would consider an abortion. And a lot of times a child with special needs is the reason why a woman would consider an abortion. And then even beyond that, just not having the support and the resources to consider giving a child up for adoption, or then being on the other side of it, being a family that wants to adopt. So this just began ever since the beginning of the year when that happened. It just started really triggering something in me, and that I think it just kind of got the ball rolling for us.
So, like I said earlier, Bethany and her family have a very unique family situation. And I think you're absolutely right that it is tragic, but I think understandable that a family might panic or ask difficult questions when they have a diagnosis of a child with profound special needs. We have some dear friends in our lives who do have profoundly, children with profound needs, 24-hour care, who are vehement in the sanctity of the life of the child that they gave birth to, whether or not they knew beforehand, which not everybody does. Sometimes you think you're having a standard typical pregnancy and you get surprised by life, or ahead of time, and sometimes those doctors are wrong. I have had several friends who thought they were going to have a child with Down syndrome who ended up not having Down syndrome. And so really until the moment of actual birth, first of all, God can do anything that he sees fit to do, but also, and man's word is not the final say, but there's nothing that can be known until it's known, really. Everything else is just conjecture or an educated guess at best. And so many lives are terminated before necessarily someone would think they need to be out in the world, when really they might have terminated a perfectly healthy baby, or they thought otherwise. And so anyway, I love to hear about the news story about her family, and I'm going to have her tell us a little bit about her daughter Haley and how Haley came into their lives. And it's such an interesting, unique story.
Yeah. We love the story of Haley. So Haley was actually born approximately 21 weeks. There were kind of conflicting medical reports when we went through it. Between 21 and 23 weeks, she was not considered a viable pregnancy in New York. Her birth mother actually was a friend of mine, someone that we knew. But she was actually very ill. She had cancer when she got pregnant and just didn't know she had cancer. And so, long story short, she was just not physically capable of carrying her baby full term. So she went into an emergency delivery. Like I said, Haley was born approximately between 21 and 23 weeks. She was 495 grams at birth. So everything that I've done in my research, that's closer to 21 weeks. She was born with a very small chance of survival. She did receive medical treatment at Albany Med. They were wonderful. The NICU was very supportive. But anyway, of course, her mother ended up, in the end, she did pass away. And then her father just wasn't really involved at that point. And so Haley was at St. Margaret's Children's Hospital after that. And when our family kind of became aware of the situation with Haley, I had been married to my husband for a little over a year. And we'd actually just had a miscarriage. And so we didn't have any children yet. And I had been nannying for premature infant boys before that. So I think part of that maybe kind of got me a little bit more ambitious about the possibility of getting involved with a child born premature, but we just felt very strongly that God put it on our heart just to help get her out of the hospital. So, I keep saying long story short, it's such a long story. But we went to her father, and he was agreeable. He liked the idea of us kind of taking her into our home. And so when we first, and then of course I found out I was pregnant actually. So the whole time we're getting ready to learn how to care for her, of course I was pregnant with our first born. And so really, I think the thing is, when I look at where she's come from, so she was born extremely premature. She has retinopathy of prematurity, so she's mostly blind. So she's learning Braille and all that now. But when we took her home from the hospital, she was almost 2 years old, barely sitting up on her own. She had been on a full-time 24/7 continuous feeding tube drip. So she was completely eating via feeding tube. She was very severely behind in all areas. They said she'd probably never walk, never talk, never any of these things, never get off a feeding tube, and that she was totally blind. And we're like, okay. So that was the initial part of her story. We ended up taking her home, and we have a very supportive church. We have, and she actually has 8 birth siblings who are very involved in her life and are just wonderful to her. And so just really our community, our faith community, our friends and family, they were a great support to us, which is really what we'd like to be able to be through this adoption agency. But we ended up pursuing adoption after she'd been in our care for a while. And she has blossomed. She has done everything that they said she would never do, with the exception of she's still visually impaired. And so she's, has really strong glasses and is learning Braille. But otherwise, she's a perfectly healthy, perfectly typical 7-year-old girl.
So you told me an interesting story about how when you got in the car and you brought Haley home, how overwhelming it was because of the tubes and the food and all the things all the kind of care that she required. I think a lot of parents would think that would be preventative, or that maybe they have children already. You didn't have children at the time, but you went on and Bethany is having another child very soon. When do you do?
Around Thanksgiving.
Okay. So, and congratulations. I think parents either with children currently would think I could never do that, or would take attention away maybe from my biological children, or that it would be so all-encompassing to have it. I will say some of the special needs families that we know, someone did ask me recently, do they hire a caregiver when they go on vacation? And I said, absolutely not. They have fought very hard for every accommodation for their child, from wheelchairs to medications, to treatments and therapies. And so this is not like adopting a puppy. This is a human being that you take a child into your life, into your heart, and you've done so many things. So will you just tell us a little bit about like that first day, that first car ride where they threw a bunch of stuff at you and you had to drive away your husband, wasn't in town and all these things.
Yeah. So looking back on it, and I joke around with my husband, like he was actually just working that day when I went to pick her up from the hospital, bring her home. And in retrospect, I think like, what was I thinking? Why didn't we take the day off together and go do that? But, it's I will say this, but before completely answering your question, I think one of the things that we don't always give credit to is really the grace of God. So I remember people telling us at the time, like, I just can't believe you're doing this. Like, people don't do this. And I remember my husband and I just thinking, like, who wouldn't do this? Like, we didn't feel like we were doing anything extra special. And I think the reality is we felt very strongly there was just his grace on us to do it. Like, we felt like it was something God was leading us to do. So there was that supernatural grace. So in general, like when we step out in faith and do things, I believe that God does give us a supernatural ability to do what we would have otherwise on our own not been able to do. But yeah, I went there and I was, it was March 18th and Johnny was born in August. So what was I, 5 months or 4 months pregnant? And I think I was just getting over morning sickness, and I'll never forget. I went straight to the police station to make sure that I had the car seat like installed correctly because I was the first time mom. I had, there were all these things, and so we went and I did that, and then I went over to St. Margaret's, and I had to fill out all this paperwork to have her discharged, and we'd been given custody at that point, so there was all this legal stuff going on too, and they gave me like garbage bags full of stuff like masks. She was had some stuff with like some kind of, she was never on a ventilator, but I'm trying to remember what that was all about. It didn't last for very long though, but she had to have some kind of like breathing thing for a little while. Just gave me all this medical equipment, and we had to learn how to replace her Mickey button, which is, her feeding tube, all this stuff. And they just gave me all this stuff, stacks of like medical paperwork and all these. And they just were like, they all said goodbye, and the nurses took pictures with her, and I got in the car and we drove away, and I'm thinking, no big deal. This is what the plan was all along. And I'm driving, and I hear her like cough in the back, and I just started to freak out because I couldn't see her, and I'm like, would she just stop breathing? Like, is that one of her special needs that I'm just not aware of? Like, what was I thinking? And I just started sobbing, and I went straight to my parents at church because I knew they were at church. I got out of the car and I was like, what was I thinking? Like, they're like, it's okay. We're going to pray, and we're going to go over to Bed Bath & Beyond. We'll buy you one of those little mirrors so you can see her. And just the weightiness of it, just, I think, settling on me was like, okay. And I'm sure I was very emotional and hormonal as well, being pregnant. But it was, it wasn't just like I didn't have any other children at the time, but I was pregnant, and then he was born 5 months later. So I only had 5 months with this special needs child before I had a newborn to care for. And it didn't all just go away. She had 9 specialists, and I was overseeing 15 weekly therapy sessions, and all these. She had to go to Rochester for stuff for her. There was all kinds of stuff to oversee, but we just took it one day at a time, and God's grace was sufficient. And she's a member of our family, so we just did like we would for any of our children, and it just became our norm, and we just learned how to process it all. Yeah.
So you were really thrown in the deep end, like
for sure.
Day one, more than deep end. It was like you were in the ocean. Yeah. Yeah. So you have Haley. She's part of your family. Now your family's growing. You have another child. Now you get another child. Sure. And so with Saving Grace Adoptions, people who, you obviously have experience and a heart for people who just probably would be thunderstruck like you were, from those first days. Sure. So will there be ongoing help at all, or resources for once maybe an adoption is finished? Like, do you see in the future that parents, certainly you would be somebody who knows who to call. Even for a prayer, is there something that parents, going forward, maybe once an adoption is finalized, or they're in the foster care system, or they've taken, like you did, a friend or neighbor's child that they're, they've taken in or something. Yeah. Walking with them through this maze of emotions and family support, whether they are integrating or have a new family like you, but just, I can't even imagine the emotions that someone must go through, frustration and being overwhelmed and anxiousness. So is that part of the ongoing process, like any kind of counseling connections that will be made?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, this is very much so like kind of the birthing stage of this organization. But what I'd like to see happen is to create like much of what you're talking about, like a community, a support community where people can either talk to other people that have been through it, get some advice, sure, send a prayer request, let us pray with you. Or at the very least, if we're even able to help connect people that are looking for that kind of relationship, even with other people that are available to give it. And so, yeah, I would love to see that kind of just community. I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. I would love to develop like an account where we're able to actually facilitate, benevolence offerings to different families. For us, it ended up being a private adoption. It only ended up costing about $5,000. We just basically had to pay a lawyer we ended up being in court with the birth father for this particular situation. So it's just a matter of paying a lawyer to kind of facilitate that for us. So it's actually a lot less expensive than your average adoption, but that was still money we didn't have, and so anything that we could do to help support that as well. But really, primarily just being a resource and a support. So whether it's, that community piece or if we can give something financially once we've got that, whatever we can do to support people is really our heart.
So a lot of the way I feel about this is how I feel about missions is not everyone can travel the world,
Sure.
but everyone in some capacity can help by giving money.
Yeah.
That's really how I feel about adoption is maybe you don't have the grace, like you said, that there really is a measure of grace that's given to people. There are people who work with abused and trafficked children that I think I can't go there. That's a no-fly zone for me, but I would give money to their organization to help the person. And so anyway, so for Saving Grace Adoptions and for the event, I'm going to have Bethany talk for a minute about the event that's coming up and what you can do to help, because like I said, maybe you're not called, maybe you're above the age in which adoption would be practical for you or your situation, or you have the kind of lifestyle that just would not facilitate more children or a special needs child because of where you are in your life. That's okay. It doesn't remove the mandate that we are to take care of the fatherless and the widow, especially as members of the church. And I never want to let the world outgive and facilitate what the church is doing. And so, anyway, there are opportunities to get involved. I know that some of the ways are you can donate goods from your business to Bethany. There aren't very many days left to do that before this particular event. I'm assuming other events will come down the road that people can maybe get involved in if you're going to do fundraisers and that sort of thing. So I'm going to let Bethany talk for just a minute about the upcoming event that is really the launching of this I guess I'm going to call it a ministry, and have her tell you how you can get involved and contact.
Great, thank you. So yeah, for this initial event, there's two ways. You can either be a donator, what we're calling sponsors, where you sponsor like a basket or an item or something that we can use for the silent auction, because people that do come that evening are going to have the opportunity to bid on those items. We will take cash donations as well if there's nothing that you have specifically that is like a product or like a gift card. Certainly that would be a great blessing as well. So that's one way, is to contribute toward the actual fundraiser, the auction. We are collecting all of those by this coming Sunday, the 21st, just so I have a few days to kind of label things and make sure it's organized before we do the auction for the event on Wednesday. So the deadline for that will pretty much be Sunday, the 21st. You can either reach out to me via our Facebook event, which will have a link on the site. Saving Grace Adoptions, let me make sure I have that correct. Yes, savinggraceadoptions@gmail.com is our email specifically for this. You could send that there. You could reach out to me personally. And then the other thing is really just come out and support the actual event. Obviously, we don't make any money if we have a bunch of donations, but there's nobody there to buy items in the auction, or grab a drink from, there'll be a cash bar that's open, available, have a glass of wine. All of that is going to actually go toward the fundraiser. It's just going to be a fun night out anyway. Lots of people from our local community, You could bring a friend, even if you don't plan to spend a whole bunch of money. Just even getting the word out is really wonderful. And they're going to have like hot hors d'oeuvres. Glenn Peter just does that for us. It's just something that they do as a part of their fundraising initiative. So we'll have, hors d'oeuvres, and it's 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., so it won't be a late evening. So either contributing and donating goods for the auction, or just flat donations are wonderful, or just coming out and supporting us and being a part of the actual event itself is also a great way to get involved.
So before we end our interview, I want to ask Bethany a little bit about what she does with Albany Worships. So Bethany runs Albany Worships. They do group events around the capital region, really kind of anywhere in this area. So I'm going to have her talk a little bit about what she does in her spare time. Tell me a little bit about Albany Worships,
Sure.
What it is, and maybe how people can get connected with it if they want to come be part and worship with you.
Yeah. Albany Worships has been just such a blessing to me personally, and just to be able to be a part of it, let alone lead it, has been awesome. But AW, as we call it, exists to unite the Church of the Capital District through corporate worship and prayer, and also bring the presence of God to our city. We really believe that, especially the closer we get to end times, which I don't know when that is, but we're closer than we've ever been.
Sure.
The church being the bride that Jesus plans to come back for is really a passion of mine, and us being one is something that God has just really given me a very strong initiative and burden for. And so what we do is we work with churches and fellowships and ministries all over the Capital District, and the primary thing we're doing right now is we'll host it used to be quarterly. This past spring it was basically monthly, where we do corporate worship gatherings. And on any given night, our worship team will be made up of like 7 different fellowships, worship team members from different churches. We just spend an evening in worship and prayer, and people from all over the Capital District will come out. It's been really powerful to just seek God together. It's not really any specific church that's being highlighted. Like, obviously, my church is the one doing the primary hosting of it and facilitating the funds and all of that. They've been great, but it's never been about building up my church or trying to grow another church. It's really about uniting the church in the Capital District, because I believe that's what's on God's heart. And there's just been so much love and beauty and fellowship and connecting with other people. And I'm finding there's just such a purity in our worship when we're for one another, and it's not about, there could be a competitive spirit so easily in the church, and I've just not experienced any of that since we've really been doing this the last few years. And then the other piece of it, outside of uniting the church, is we really feel called to bring the presence of God to our city, which is why I initially really responded to. We led worship at the March for Life recently, and just to have an opportunity to lead worship like outside the Capitol in downtown Albany, and to bring the presence of God to that place, to me was worth whatever we had to do to get there and set up for it. It was just a really awesome opportunity to bring the presence of God to an otherwise worldly environment.
I was at that event. I loved that there were people who were obviously Catholic.
Yeah.
They had their signs
Sure.
and their statues and things. And then there was people who were obviously more on the charismatic end. And I just thought it was so fascinating. And there were a few songs that kind of everybody knew. Maybe you heard them on Christian radio or something. So it was really cool to watch people kind of like put their arms around each other and like rock back and forth and sing worship. And the news was there. Yeah, it was a really powerful event. So if you want to check out Albany Worships, AW, they can go to Facebook and just take a look at it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's just Albany Worships. It's just Albany Worships. Make sure you have the S at the end. Is our Facebook page. So I think if you just like us, then you get like updates and stuff like that. So
okay. All right, awesome. Well, thank you, Bethany, for an awesome interview. I hope you guys take a look at we'll post all the links on the Alive Radio Network page. Thank you for joining me today for our very first interview on Living Out Loud with Bethany.